The morning of January 24th, 1987, was a rainy Saturday morning in Martinez, California. 9-year-old Eric Coy had just telephoned his aunt to ask if he could go play at his cousin's house, and off he went on his bicycle at 10:55 a.m. That was the last time that anyone would see poor Eric alive. Just 18 minutes later, his slain body was found slumped on a sidewalk face down, with his bicycle nearby. His body was found by another child who had been playing at the Boys and Girls Center nearby and saw him. The boy ran back to bring his friends to help Eric, thinking he had fallen off his bicycle, and thus began the story of the most tragic and mysterious unsolved murder of Martinez, California. I'm going to be reviewing the forensic astrology of this incident using a chart cast for the time that young Eric's body was found, which was 11:13 a.m. on January 24th, 1987. And it has a lot of unusual features which may explain why the perpetrator to this day has not been found. I only recently learned of this crime, and it was so disturbing that I needed to find out more about it. So let's take a look at the chart cast for 11:13 a.m. when he was found. The first thing I look at is the ascendant, which is 1 degree of Taurus, and that means that Eric's significator is Venus. Venus is at 17 Sagittarius in the 8th house, and it forms a square to the ruler of the 8th house, which is Jupiter. That instantly tells me that, unfortunately, the victim has passed away. When the ascendant ruler is in the 8th house, contacts the 8th house ruler, or forms harsh aspects with other planets like Mars and Saturn and Pluto, then something seriously wrong has happened and the person is probably deceased. And so is the case with Eric. In the 8th house, you'll see that Venus is super conjunct Saturn. They're in the same degree and they're separated only by 12 minutes of arc. So that's a pretty damning statement as to Eric's status. He had been murdered. His body was filled with puncture wounds caused by a sharp object, probably a knife, and his throat was cut from ear to ear. And with those arrows of Sagittarius, I believe they do represent the sharp object that killed him. It was a horrific sight, and everyone who saw it could not get it out of their minds. The tragedy of this is that Eric had just left his home at 10:55 a.m., and yet only 18 minutes later is found dead. That's an extremely tight window of activity for the killer to have come across him, battled with him because he had defensive wounds showing this, and then killing him in a very brutal way. So we'll focus on that time lapse in the chart and also try to get some clues about who possibly could have done this. At the end of the video, I will be talking about a possible suspect who was only picked up about a little over a year ago, and I believe he may be the right person who committed this crime. One thing I also noticed right away is the unique shape of the horoscope. It's what we call a bowl, the shape of a bowl, because the upper hemisphere is filled with planets, while the only things that are in the lower hemisphere are the South Node and Black Moon Lilith. We'll get to her in a little while. But as for the bowl, it's in the public sector of the horoscope. This was a very public crime. It was committed in broad daylight on a street near a school, community center where kids were meeting and playing as it was a Saturday morning. So this was a crime of just really bizarre opportunity and scary too for all the residents because someone just came out of nowhere and murdered an innocent young child. In fact, the community was traumatized about it for years afterwards, and people today still remember the impact that it had on them and their families. So with everything ranging from the 7th to the 12th houses, This is in broad daylight, in plain sight, and it got tremendous publicity. It still gets publicity now if you check the internet for the keywords Eric Coy murder. And yet, with all the public attention, there was no evidence pointing to a perpetrator. And if you notice, Neptune at 6 Capricorn is in the ninth house of law enforcement. They were confused, they didn't know what had happened, and they couldn't figure it out for all these years afterwards. And they only now have an idea of a person of interest. The Venus that rules Eric is conjoined to Saturn and also Uranus. And there you go with the shock impact of the crime, the sudden attack on a young boy who was simply riding his bicycle to go visit his cousin. So the eighth house is spelling out the incident. And so we can also look at Mars in the 12th for the perpetrator. And that is a very interesting aspect because just moments before, Mars was ruling this chart. What caught me was the 1 degree Taurus rising. That represents that something just changed within minutes before this. When Eric left his home, Aries was rising. And I believe that as Aries transitioned into Taurus rising on the ascendant, that is when he was murdered. There's only an 18-minute window for that to happen. And I'm going to show you the chart. Aries was active and strong, and Eric was on his way to a day of fun and excitement. But then when it transitioned into Taurus, you go from an active, strong, aggressive sign to one that is much more muted and passive. And that's what happened based on when he left his house at 10:55 a.m. And you'll see what I mean by following through with the actions. He was on his way to a play date. Suddenly, he's overtaken by someone else, where he suddenly goes from being in control of his destiny to being completely out of control of it. And the fact that Venus, which rules Eric in the final crime chart, is peregrine and it's super conjunct Saturn. They're separated by only 12 minutes of arc. And Venus is in mutual reception with Jupiter. That's important too. Jupiter rules Sagittarius, the house of death here. Venus is exalted in Pisces, where Jupiter is, and Venus is in Sagittarius, which Jupiter rules. So if you were to look at this chart and not know the fate of the person, let's say it was just a missing person and not someone that we know was murdered, you would have to think that there's a high likelihood that the person was deceased, was murdered, as the crime chart is spelling out, with the activity between the ruler of the person and the rulers of death and the eighth house in that very limited span of time. So Mars represents the killer at this point. Mars and Pluto actually rule Scorpio, which is on the seventh house of the perpetrator. And Mars being in Aries, it's powerful, it's in control, and it's in the 12th house. So I suspect that the perpetrator was scouting around or stalking for a child. Possibly he knew that there were kids nearby playing. So he's what I call lying in wait in the 12th house. And he gets what he wants because Mars is extremely strong in Aries. And Pluto's in the house of the perpetrator at 9 Scorpio. I think this person was a sexual deviant, somebody looking to do harm to a young boy. And that's exactly what he did. And that's what he did in the span of a very short period of time. We can see that the moon is also in Scorpio at 27 degrees, late in the seventh house. And the thing about late degree planets that is uncomfortable in crime charts is that they're either in the term of Mars or Saturn. Anything from maybe 25 degrees on of any sign is in the terms of Mars or Saturn, which shows cruelty, violence, death, decadence. There's also the fact that Mercury here is in Aquarius, and that rules a small child, a young person. So I would use that as a secondary ruler for Eric. And he was going out to socialize. The Mercury's in Aquarius, and it also rules the Aquarius would rule the shocking thing that happened to him. being suddenly overtaken while he's innocently riding his bicycle. And the perpetrator's secondary ruler would be Sun at 4 Aquarius at the midheaven. And Sun is close to Mercury, so again, we have someone spying on him, seeing him out riding his bicycle, and deciding on the spur of the moment that what he wanted to do was kill this young child. The sign of Aquarius tells us again a shock attack, sudden, unpredictable, seemingly out of nowhere. And if we look down at Black Moon Lilith at the 4th house, it's in 0 Leo, the sign of children, opposing the sun of the perpetrator. He was struck by a sudden devilish urge to just go out and raise mayhem, and he chose to do it on the body of poor little Eric. The sun also squares Pluto, so obviously the person is mentally deranged, if not sexually perverted, to say the least. And the fact that Lilith has just entered Leo and is retrograde fits into the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the passage of time between when Eric left his home at 10:55 and when he was found deceased just 18 minutes later. So we look at that chart and we get 24 Aries rising, and not really much has changed except for the house cusps. Everything else pretty much stays the same. The moon has bumped into the 8th house, but it's pretty descriptive of where it was already. This is interesting. When you see charts of incidents with very low degrees, it really pays to look at what preceded it because there's a dramatic change there. Of course, the planets and houses are changing all the time, all throughout the day. But when it's a crime or an event that is significant, it does speak to us about previous acts to the crime. So here, what's interesting is that the ascendant ruler is Mars, which is Eric. And at that point in time, he's leaving his house with his bicycle, saying goodbye to his parents, and embarking on a 5-minute ride over to his cousin's house. Mars in Aries shows he was active, he was going somewhere, he was busy, and he was in control of himself. Sadly, that changes right around 11 o'clock, just about 5, 6 minutes later. I think it was about 11:02 a.m. when the house is ruled then by Taurus, and the ascendant changes from Aries to Taurus. That makes Eric then ruled by Venus, which has lost control because he's now bumped up against Saturn in the 8th house of murder and death. So Eric loses control at that point in time. And that's what the ascendant in Taurus is telling us. He was fine until he met the man while he was riding the bicycle, and then the roles reverse. And the man and the person in control is now the perpetrator, ruled by Aries. But here, let's look at the perpetrator being Venus and figure out what that was up to. Well, that's conjunct Saturn, and it's in the 8th, and that's what he had on his mind, as these are going into the 9th house of motive and intent. Uranus is right on the 9th house cusp. He didn't have a fixed intent. His mind was deranged. He suddenly decided, impulsively, to abduct Eric and kill him on the spot, knocking him off his bicycle. So that's pretty much telling us what he was thinking. And the ruler of the 9th house of his thoughts and motivations is Jupiter on the 12th, and it's in Pisces. I think the man was seriously impaired by drugs, alcohol, mental instability, or all of the above. He was intent on doing evil, and he succeeded, and he got away with it for many, many years. Hopefully now he will be somebody that we can consider is already in custody. As for the 9th house of the perpetrator's thoughts and motivations, Neptune is also there. So that just fortifies what I said about being drunk, impaired on drugs, or all of the above. So what I want to do now is break down the asteroids. This is not intended to be a really, really detailed analysis. It is just giving us the basic structure of what I look for in a crime chart. So the asteroids I am finding are as descriptive as anything else I've ever worked with. So I'm going to take a look at those. They are not shown in the charts because it would be too crowded and it would take up probably the whole chart. So I'm just going to describe their location and their meaning. When we looked at the sun at 4 Aquarius for a secondary ruler of the perpetrator, that's opposite the asteroid Kagura at 4 Leo. Kagura has to do with something that happens suddenly. It's like a bolt out of the blue, a quick strike, a lightning bolt. And that's exactly what this crime was. And what's interesting is Kagura is not in quite in orb of Black Moon Lilith. They're separated by about 4 degrees. But the sun opposes Lilith as well as Kagura, and so that unites them. So this quick strike was something of real evil and cruelty. The next asteroid is Tantalus, which is conjunct the sun at 5 degrees of Aquarius, and that also opposes it to Kagura. Tantalus is actually the root of the word tantalize, and it's something that tempts us. We see something that we want, and we have to have it. If we're really hungry and we see food in the store window, we have to have that. We have to go in and buy it and eat it. It's that kind of a visceral drive to have something that you want. So this perpetrator saw poor little Eric, decided that was who and what he wanted, and he took him. The next one is, this is really kind of a bizarre interpretation, but I think it fits. Mars is at 11 of Aries in the 12th house, and it's in opposition to Terpsichore, an asteroid which is at 11 degrees Libra. It's an exact opposition to the degree. I use mainly only a 1 degree orb for any of my asteroid analyses. Occasionally, I'll stretch it to 2, but here it's exact. Terpsichore was a Greek goddess who was very involved with dance. She would actually get high on certain substances, whatever they were back in Greek times. I don't know, probably drinking. But she was known for dancing wildly and erratically and crazily. She would just fling her arms and legs around like a banshee and go into a trance like state. Why this is meaningful here, and it's kind of an ugly image, is that Eric had defensive wounds when he was being attacked. And I think that describes a very frantic physical altercation between him and the killer, waving arms and legs. And, it's kind of a horrible image. But the asteroid is describing the activity at that moment. So it is important to note that. Also, Mercury, which rules a young person, is at 12 Aquarius and makes a trine to Terpsichore as well. The North Node is in the 12th house near Mars at 14 Aries. It's conjunct the asteroid Eris, Eris, which was the goddess of discord. And she was somebody who was somewhat of a woman warrior. She fought for her survival. She fought for what she thought was right. And she is known as a kind of a disagreeable goddess, but the fighting also comes into play here with the interaction between Eric and the killer. Venus is at 17 Sagittarius, exactly conjoined to the asteroid Hermes, and as well as Saturn. And Hermes is again a young, active person. He's the messenger god in Greek mythology, and he's fast. He's small, he's young, and he's fast. And that's what Eric was. He was probably speeding along on his bike, and it must have taken a shocking, sudden stop by this perpetrator to knock him off and attack him. I also want to bring in the idea of using asteroids as possible names. Thousands of them are named after various people, famous scientists, celebrities, and a lot of them just convey one single name, like John or Barbara. You can actually look these up in a person's chart and see if there's any emphasis on the name in relation to the person's personal planets. And I like to do that in crime charts as well, just to see if it yields anything of interest. In this case, I really wanted to find out if we could get the name of a suspect. Actually, just over a year ago, a man was picked up in relation to the homicide of a young boy, I believe it was 11-year-old boy named Jeremy Stoner in Vallejo, California. And that happened in February of '87, just weeks after the murder of Eric Coy. And they do have evidence linking this man to Jeremy's murder, and they're investigating right now if there's a possible connection with Eric. Even though Jeremy was strangled and Eric was stabbed, there are other similarities that make law enforcement believe that the same man committed both murders. The name of the person of interest is Frederick Cain III, spelled Cain. So, of course, I love to travel down rabbit holes, so I checked out the name Frederick and its possible importance in this chart using the 1113 chart with Venus rising. And I see that Frederick is at 9 Capricorn. And isn't that interesting because it makes a sextile to the seventh house Pluto at 9 Scorpio. I also meant to say that the 9 Scorpio for Pluto shows somebody with a compulsion to do what he does. It's an obsession compulsion type of thing. And that's why he was out looking to do something horrible, but it was spur of the moment that he happened to spot Eric in his sights. The next thing about asteroid Frederick is that Frederick at 9 Capricorn squares Mars at 11 Aries. So it's making a second contact to what represents the perpetrator. And finally, 9 Capricorn is 3 degrees away from the ninth house Neptune, which is not within orb exactly, but it's there. And so I'm thinking maybe there's a possibility that this is the same person who murdered Jeremy Stoner. And so then I look at his last name, Cain. This is where it's kind of pushing the envelope, but just out of interest. Canes, Canes, the object of a walking cane, is ruled by Taurus and Sagittarius, what I get from Rex Bill's rulership book. That's kind of interesting because in the pre-crime chart where Aries is rising, Taurus is on the seventh house of the perpetrator, ruling Cain, and also Sagittarius is in the eighth house of death and murder. In fact, Sagittarius is where Eric's Venus falls at the time of the crime. So, for what it's worth, just a little tangent into using names of asteroids. I do find them relevant. It takes some looking up because, as I said, there are thousands of them. But if you do it and you look at the minorplanet.org website, you'll get a good start on being able to check out names that may be of relevance in your charts. So, if you're interested in learning more about the techniques I use in forensic astrology, I'll just take a moment for a shameless plug. I have written several books on the topic. My first one was Forensics by the Stars. My second one was Exploring Forensic Astrology. And my most recent is Asteroids, Our Cosmic Influencers. So I'm putting a link in the description below where you can find all my written works. And if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, what have you, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And so I'll look forward to hearing from you. I'm B.D. Salerno, also known as Star Sleuth. Thanks for watching.